Welcome to the Regen Room. I'm here with Cameron Crowe. Cameron is the director of Leave No Trace Australia and is also sitting on the board of WEJUGO, or is a shareholder in WEJUGO, I should say. WEJUGO is the safety adventure database platform that I was planning on using for the big bike ride. So, really grateful that Cameron has come on as an extension to that now. So, hey, how you going, Cameron?
Yep, good mate. Travelling well. And enjoying a bit of a quieter lifestyle like everyone else at the moment, I trust.
That's it, mate. Yeah, definitely. Everything is slowing down for sure. Hey, I was wondering if firstly you could just start off by giving us a little bit of a background into Leave No Trace and what those 7 principles actually are.
Yeah, so Leave No Trace is an international minimal impact education program, originated in the US and through an organisation called the National Outdoor Leadership School, who teach wilderness expeditions. It's become a global program, multilingual. It's headquartered out of Boulder in Colorado. It originated in the US through the 4 federal land management agencies and the numbers of people impacting on natural areas. It's become a well-used international program. It's accepted as best practice by the World Travel Organization and adopted by various land management agencies internationally. So it's based around 7 principles. If you get a bunch of people in the room and you ask them questions about what are all the impacts that people have when they go into natural areas, you can always pretty much cluster them. Haven't come across something yet which can't be clustered under one of 7 principles. So they are, plan ahead and prepare, travel and camp on durable surfaces, dispose of waste properly, leave what you find, minimise the impact of fire, respect wildlife, and be considerate of other visitors. So it covers a broad range, and some of those issues are bigger impacts in some of our behaviours, and they vary. They're universal principles, but how they actually hit the ground, they actually incorporate all different regions and their biodiversity. So, and all different landform types. So they can be applied generally, and basically the principles are principles. They're not a set of laws or fixed things you have to obey. They're actually guides to being able to move in the landscape and read the situation that you're in and apply those principles to what's the most effective and sensible behaviour in a particular location.
Mm. Yeah, they're pretty basic principles by the sounds of it, but they have obviously a knock-on effect when it comes to taking care of the environment. So the environmental regeneration that needs to take place sometimes once tourists come through an area and potentially damage it. You mentioned that you wanted to talk briefly about biosecurity. So I was just wondering, what is the actual relationship between biosecurity and environmental regeneration here in Australia?
Well, I think since our settler era, where we've colonised the country and basically utilised every bit of available space for European-style agriculture, the remnant pieces of nature that haven't been economically valuable in the past have become incredibly valuable for people's recreation and tourism and people's mental well-being. And so those areas are coming under increasing pressure. Originally reserved for their aesthetic values, but more recently for their natural values and repositories of biological processes that maintain a healthy ecosystem both locally and globally. With the advent of mass tourism, which has been stopped in its tracks recently, and it is definitely a blessing that we've got some space to actually rethink the direction we've been heading and what we need to do with regard to travel and our access and use of the natural resources and protected areas that are left. The key thing, I guess, is to maintain the healthy processes that are remain in heavily impacted areas. It's interesting that most of the world's biodiversity now is actually actively managed by Indigenous people who still rely on the natural environment for their livelihood, their sustenance, and their cultural practices. So even though in the West we have, or in Western European culture, we've formally protected under legislation areas of that have got natural values, we've effectively removed humans from those landscapes and significantly altered the natural processes and the husbandry and the stewardship that those people practiced in those areas that have been honed and developed over thousands and tens of thousands of years. So I think where we are at the moment, say in Australia, the National Biodiversity Plan that's been signed off and agreed by the state and federal government here identified people movement as one of the two significant biodiversity pathways for incursions, feral species and invasive species into Australia and other countries. The principle is the same for other countries. People movement and trade are the two major vectors for incursions, and we need to be very, very aware of our hygiene practices, that we don't carry invasive species with us into protected areas. So first of all, I think in terms of regenerative processes, we need to stop the spread of invasive species, and then by reconsidering what's happened in the last decade and a half or 2 decades, where mass tourism has started putting incredible pressure on regional governments, state governments to open up protected areas for commercial tourism and commercial recreation. And the argument that's put forward is that unless people are exposed to natural environments, they won't value them, and there won't be the political will to invest in national parks and protected areas and look after them adequately. That's the argument that's been put forward, and I guess after a decade or 2 decades of experience, it's very, very clear that governments continue to defund national parks and the management of protected areas, and constrain people's ability to act as stewards for those protected areas. So I think that's an environmental issue that hasn't been called out, that hasn't been adequately addressed by the major environmental organisations, and obviously the people who are concerned to maintain those natural areas don't have the resources, the political lobbying capacity that the commercial interests have to exploit those natural resources. So I'm all for people getting into natural areas and experiencing them, but there's been, one of the first things protected area managers do when governments cut their budgets is they go back to providing essential services, basically. And unfortunately, one of the first things that goes is environmental education. So places that have had in the past strong environmental education programs around minimal impact of recreation and tourism impacts in natural areas, those programs have been slashed. The education has stopped, and you see more and more the reverting back to where things were 20 or 30 years ago, where people are lighting campfires on peat soils, say in Tasmania, in wilderness areas, which predominantly behaviours had improved so that people respected fuel stove only areas. People's toilet behaviour has deteriorated, so people are now getting sick from washing dishes or taking water for cooking out of freshwater streams. Those sort of impacts are escalating again, and people's awareness about issues like dieback, Phytophthora dieback, and its capacity to destroy whole landscapes of plant species and therefore fauna that rely on plant species. Issues like being aware of Didymo, a waterborne plant that turned up in the southern hemisphere in New Zealand some 2 decades ago, and has really infected very badly a lot of the freshwater streams in the southern island of New Zealand, and would do immense damage in places like Tasmania again. There's very little awareness about people's level of hygiene with regard to washing boats when they, if they've gone paddling or kayaking in New Zealand, or trout fishing or whatever, any water sports, anything, and even swimming. More recently we've seen myrtle rust on the east coast come in, and that has had a massive spread, and is spread by just brushing on people's clothes, and as they walk through the bush they spread it everywhere. It's an airborne spreading vector. So all these things accumulate into an already heavily impacted landscape by agriculture and other industrial scale processes. So yeah, the challenges are big, notwithstanding the pressures that are coming on those natural environments from macro forces like climate change. At an individual level, our practices, whether it's to do with climate change or our recreation practices, going for walks or paddling or climbing or whatever it is, horse riding, four-wheel driving, surfing, fishing, getting access to different areas, all those things need to be approached and practiced with a high level of awareness around particularly biosecurity issues, but also about the range of other practices that Leave No Trace advocates about: fire behaviour, toilet behaviour, planning ahead. So you've actually got a bit of a plan. You understand the environment you're going into, and you take the appropriate actions to minimise your impact.
Yes. So as a starting point for someone, the Leave No Trace principles are a really great resource. So I'd urge anyone watching this that does enjoy taking a hike or going out into nature, going camping for longer periods of time, to make sure you look into those Leave No Trace principles and practice them when you do go. And then I think further to that, definitely do some research around where you're going and what are the native species and what are the invasive species. And Cameron, I just want to ask further to that, if there was someone who, enjoys the outdoors and wants to continue to enjoy them and enjoy our natural areas, and even maybe wanted to talk to government or someone to seek out how to protect those areas furthermore, how would they do that?
Well, there's a lot of free Leave No Trace material on the internet, either through Leave No Trace Australia or Leave No Trace in America and New Zealand. What you say there, Josh, is correct. You need to understand the environment you're heading into, particularly the local environment. It's not hard to. Most states in Australia have the protected area managers have good information on them. There are some really big issues, like you're in the southeast of Queensland. I mean, fire ants there are a big problem. I mean, there's hundreds of millions of dollars being committed to getting on top of the fire ant problem. It's not the only invasive ant in Australia, but if you're just travelling around Australia and you just happen to pass through northern New South Wales or southeast Queensland and pick up ants and carry them with you to your next camping spot or whatever, you could have it's a very significant issue. So really it is about local knowledge and applying those general principles about really good hygiene, make sure you clean things up well, use fuel stoves rather than wood stoves, or only use wood in campfires where there's an abundance of wood, and you're not continuing to diminish the fallen wood resource that's there, that's a habitat for species. Just because they're not macro species doesn't mean to say they're not important. And over a period of time, if everyone's always harvesting wood from the same area, obviously that has a cumulative impact over a long period of time. So really it's being mindful about your practices, about those simple 7 principles, and just applying them generally and continually improving, I guess. I guess that's one of the approaches to leave no trace is we all, very, very rarely do you come across somebody who's willfully damaging the environment. So we've all got our own personal ethics about protecting and practicing stewardship for natural areas. And really it's about improving those all the time so that, we continue to minimise our impact
I think
we go through life.
Definitely. Yeah, we're kind of getting a bit of a shock lesson in that at the moment now with the coronavirus spreading between humans. But I suppose there's a lesson in that reminder that we are part of the natural world. When this does pass and we do have that opportunity to go back into our natural areas, let's not forget that we are part of the natural world and that we are potentially carrying with us certain microbes that aren't supposed to be in other areas. For me, that seems like a no-brainer and something that can be taken away from what we're experiencing now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're all still trying to get some sort of understanding about how changed the world will be when we come out of this event. But one thing's for sure is that this isn't a once in 100-year event. I mean, people talk about 1 in 100-year or 500-year floods, and we know they come every 10 or 20 years now. So because of climate change and other pressures on natural environments, there is no doubt that we will be dealing with rolling crises over the decades ahead. And so, we need to consider that in terms of all our activities, including travel and recreation.
For sure. And just quickly, Cameron, one last question. If you could just provide us with a little bit of advice, what's something that you think that humans might benefit from knowing at the moment?
From what at the moment?
What's something that one piece of advice you might have that humans might benefit from knowing?
Oh, that's a that's a big question. Probably comes down to economics and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who were disciples of the economist Hayek. Margaret Thatcher said there was no such thing as society, and where we've wound up is, several decades later, the practice of that philosophy and that economic model, neoconservative model, has meant we've wound up with a very diminished natural world and a very under threat social fabric. And I think what coronavirus has really shown us is that the social fabric is still there, but we've been dominated by an economic model that we need to discard and rebuild a future that's based around society. I saw some figures the other day on how much credit debt has been created in the world since the financial crisis, and it was in the tens of trillions of dollars. And yet in the creation of all that money supply and all that supposed wealth, you look at how much of that has actually gone into protecting the natural world and the habitat in which we live and the social fabric on which we all depend. And for me, that's the big question. Is our conversation going to be, and our practice, our life practice, going to continue to be dominated by economics, or how are we each individually going to contribute to a new form of living on the planet that is truly sustainable?
Thank you so much for that, Cameron. I really appreciate it, mate. And thanks for coming on.
No worries, Josh. Yeah, disappointed about your bike ride, but no doubt things will get better, and you'll hopefully get on your bike and get rolling.
Well, everyone's rolling with the punches at the moment, hey? So we'll see how we go.
No worries. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you, Josh. Really appreciate it.
Cheers, Cameron.